We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to this week's Easter edition of Planet Holyrood, the podcast talking all about the world of Scottish politics. I'm Chris McCall, I'm the Deputy Political Editor at the Daily Record, and I'm standing in today for our regular host, Paul Hutchin. Joining me on today's show, we have our regular guest, Douglas Dickie, who is the Content Editor at the Scottish Daily Express. And also joining us today is special guest Dan Vevers, who is the Environment Reporter at the Daily Record. Now, before we move on to talk about the big issues of the week, I wanted to briefly make a special announcement regarding our star signing for the Daily Record. From this coming Monday, First Minister John Swinney will be penning a column for the paper every second week, and his first piece will appear on Easter Monday. So make sure you pick up a copy of the paper or check out the Record Politics section on our website to see what the SNP leader has to say. But before all that, we had the confirmation this week that a by-election will be taking place in the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse constituency on Thursday, June the 5th. Now, of course, this by-election has been caused by the very sad death of Christina McKelvey, a well-liked SNP MSP who passed away last month at the age of just 57. Christina first won the seat back in 2011, and at the last election in 2021, she returned a decent majority of 4,500. But of course, a lot has happened in the 4 years since, namely a revival of Scottish Labour, which saw them comfortably win the overlapping Westminster constituencies at the UK general election last year. So let's get right down to it. Dougie, who's going to win this by-election?
The SNP are going to win this by-election because it's basically going to be a proxy referendum on the current UK government. I think that's what's going to dominate this. Labour have had a revival, obviously, in Scotland, but that revival, I mean, to say it's stalled, I think is me being kind to Anis Sarwar and Sir Keir Starmer. And I think that's what's going to dominate this. Winter fuel, WASPy, stuff like that. That's going to be the main talking points, rightly or wrongly. Holyrood issues, public services up here, I think are going to go into the background. Obviously, it's an election no one wanted. The reasons it's come about are incredibly sad. But it's a chance. It seems to me a bit of an open goal for John Swinney to sort of solidify the SNP support. I wouldn't say he's revived it, but I think what he's done is kind of arrested the slide. They've got a kind of base, 30-32%, and I think Labour are suffering badly from both the left and the right. They're losing support on the left to the likes of the SNP, and they're also losing support on the right to the likes of Reform, which I'm sure we'll come on to discuss. And so I think it really couldn't have come at a worse time for Labour. I think it's telling. When I done this show 2 weeks ago, Paul seemed quite confident that Monica Lennon was going to stand for Labour. We now know she's not. I think that's a wise move. I think the last thing Labour needs is to lose, one of its more talented politicians. So I think that says a lot about how Labour views this seat now. I think if they thought they were in a real chance of winning, I think Monica might have stood. And I think it's going to be a decent win for the SNP. And yet, and we've seen it in by-elections and council by-elections, they still struggle. The SNP still struggle. So it's maybe not as clear-cut as I'm making out, but I think the SNP will win.
And Dan, who do you think is going to do it?
Well, I also think probably the SNP, but I do think it's going to be closer than you were maybe suggesting at the start, like to say after that, maybe it might be a bit closer. The reason I think it might be closer than maybe the polls currently suggest is, a year ago, we would not have been sitting here saying the SNP would win this election, not by a long shot. Obviously, so much has changed since then. But I think this is an area that if Labour want to have any chance at all of making inroads in the election in 2026, it's the kind of area they need to start picking up seats. They've obviously pretty much had a clean sweep in the general election, and we know since then all of their troubles in the polls. But I personally think that this is going to be a really interesting by-election, a really important by-election coming so close to the Holyrood election next year. You're right that it's an opportunity for John Swinney, but it's also an opportunity for Anna Sarwar. This could be the moment when his sort of prospects are rejuvenated. Obviously, if it goes the other way, the narrative would be very, very different. But I think, although the national polling is poor for Labour just now, when it gets into local issues, as by-elections always do, when it gets into Labour traditionally being quite strong in this neck of the woods, I think things might really tighten up. I think it'll go down to the wire, and whoever wins, it could transform the narrative going into 2026.
I think whoever does win will be handed a massive boost ahead of the election next year. It'll really set the tone, I think, for the election campaign, because this is a seat that's in Greater Glasgow, it's in the commuter belt, it's the heart of the urban central belt where the majority of Scottish voters are. And if the SNP are to remain as the largest party in Holyrood, number one, and number two, if they're going to have any chance of retaining their fabled pro-independence majority, this is the kind of constituency that they have to be winning. However, on how close the race will be, I did speak to Professor John Curtis. Obviously, there's no introduction on this podcast, the expert of all experts on polling. And he did say that based on current polling, so that's what we've seen in terms of voting intentions in recent months and how the election in 2021 went, how the Westminster election went last year locally. He says if you crunch those numbers, you effectively get a dead heat between Labour and the SNP. I mean, the SNP back in 2021, remember, were polling at about 48% of the constituency. They're not gonna hit that level again. They're about 34, 35 now. Labour, on the other hand, Monica Lennon, even with the state that Labour were in 2021, she managed to return about 33%. So, I mean, that's if, obviously, it's a very big if Labour can hold the ground of where they were, and that's a big if, their vote could drop. We'll come on to reform in a second, but just to kind of talk a bit more about Labour, Keir Starmer, I said to John Curtis yesterday, I said, do you think that, given his relative unpopularity in Scotland, it would be a benefit to Scottish Labour if he stayed away? And Professor Curtis said to me, well, he's actually unpopular everywhere, not just in Scotland. But I mean, my own view is that, he's the Prime Minister, he's a leader of the Labour Party. He can't keep away, because if he didn't come up, then the SNP would just repeatedly say, where is the Prime Minister? Is he hiding? So I think we are going to have to see Keir Starmer come up at some point. But Dan, how do you think, what's the message that Labour have to get out there? How can they take the fight to the SNP on this?
Well, I mean, they've been trying their best to move the narrative in Scotland onto the SNP government's failings, in devolved areas leading up to 2026. But it's a hell of a task to switch people's focus from what's going on down in Westminster to what's going up in Holyrood, when what's happening in Westminster is dominated politics so much since Labour came in, and the hugely sort of controversial policies that have come about that to quite a lot of Labour voters and quite a lot of sort of Scottish centre-left voters don't seem particularly Labour policies. I think, Labour's message probably has to be about the economy. It has to be about stability. But they've got a lot of work to do to try and move on to what is clearly their favoured issue. Well, the NHS is one that comes up again and again, and the general state of public services. But it's tough to sort of make that case when the perception just now is that the public realm is under assault again from whether or not you call it austerity. It doesn't seem to be austerity as such, but the general sort of mood music that we're going to need more cuts doesn't necessarily play very well in Scotland. Yeah. So the question is, which party can convince the voters to punish the other guys.
Yeah.
It's ultimately what it comes down to, I think.
I think it's sorry, Chris, if I may, it's interesting you say that Labour had 33% in 2021 here. 33% is likely going to be enough to win this seat. I think whoever wins, I would caution heavily against taking it as a ringing endorsement for your policies or your party or your candidate, because I don't think neither the SNP or Labour are particularly popular, and Sir Keir Starmer's got to come up. He's got to come and shore up that that Labour vote, that core Labour vote, in what was a Labour heartland for years. So the SNP obviously really fancy it. Katie Loudon has stood before. She's obviously one who's been earmarked. I was aware of Katie from a time at the Rutherglen Reformer when she was a councillor there. She was very much one of the kind of new breed of SNP that emerged after the independence referendum. And they're obviously keen to get her into a higher position. But I think it's going to be 33% might be enough to win it. But I just can't see. I know Dan's saying they've got to shift it on to public services. They've got to shift it on. But right now, this is a midterm effectively. But it's a midterm for UK Labour and UK government, and I think it's going to be a few months before Labour can shift that narrative onto the SNP's own pitiful record in government.
Isn't it just remarkable though that a party that has been in government up here since 2007 is not actually seen as the incumbents in this by-election?
But that's what the SNP have been so good at over the years, is kind of creating that illusion that they are somehow not the establishment. They're anti-establishment, even though they are the very epitome of the Scottish political establishment. And it's a kind of, they've pulled the wool over the eyes of a lot of people, and I think they've been very effective at that.
Just one little bit of information. I spoke to the people at Ladbrokes betting yesterday, and I asked them, because bookies usually have a pretty good idea what's going on, and I said to them, who's going to be the favourite here? And they came back to me that Labour, they think, is a very, very narrow favourite at odds of 10 to 11 on, which is not exactly a tempting price for anyone out there who fancies a flutter. So I think that kind of ties in with what John Curtis said, if it's a dead heat. But there's a long way to go between now and polling day. But the other factor at play in this by-election, which we have to talk about, is that of Reform, who I think in 2021, take that back. I think at the Westminster election, in the equivalent seat last year, I think they took about 8%. I think, and that was from a standing start of them effectively having very little profile up here at all. Not now though. We don't know for certain, but we think it's pretty likely that Nigel Farage will campaign in Hamilton. He has not really been seen in a public-facing campaigning role in Scotland since, I think, the last European elections for the Brexit Party. He held a big rally at the Corn Exchange in Edinburgh, but we hadn't really seen him out in the streets since the infamous time that he had to take shelter in a pub in the Canongate. But that was obviously a long time ago. A lot of water has flowed under the bridge. But guys, a Reform, what's the impact going to be? I mean, I don't think personally they can do enough to win this seat, but I do think they can take a substantial amount of votes. Is that going to hurt Labour the most, you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to hurt Labour the most. I think they'll finish third in the seat. They've proven that it's not just disaffected Tories that they're picking up, because they're actually, in terms of council by-elections, they're actually doing better in the Central Belt than they are maybe doing in these more kind of rural areas. I think there's this idea that Reform is purely, a Tory phenomenon. It's not. It's just people are dissatisfied. And, it's funny, you were saying earlier, Chris, about this being, Greater Glasgow and part of that kind of urban, area. Lark Hall, Stonehouse, these are places that feel really left behind. They're going to be places that feel really left behind. They're going to feel really disaffected, with current politics. Holyrood is as far away to them as Westminster is, psychologically. So I can see Reform, especially in those kind of places, the kind of outlying areas, maybe not so much in Hamilton, but I can see them picking up, maybe high teens, low 20s. I don't know whether that then translates to Holyrood election next year when there's electing a government at stake. I think remains to be seen.
You agree with that, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's obviously a huge by-election for the SNP and Labour, but it's a huge by-election for Reform too. It's an opportunity for them to sort of take what seems to be the arrival of their political moment in the UK and in Scotland too, and sort of turn that from sort of theory into reality, because we've seen the polls, but this is probably one of the sort of first major political tests they've had in Scotland. And yeah, I mean, it's tough to know for sure, but you suspect they're going to do very, very well. But I think in terms of the party that's going to suffer most from this, I mean, in terms of whether they win the seat, Labour, yes, but the Tories are looking down the barrel of oblivion because of Reform. And, you wonder whether or not they'll even keep their deposit in this seat. But, when it comes down to the sort of final crunch of who's going to win this seat, you have to imagine the Reform vote can only help the SNP at the end of the day. You'd imagine they're going to take more votes from Labour voters, and there's also the added impact of just how many Labour voters who voted for Labour at the general election, for example, might just stay home. And so it's about who's going to be most motivated. I think Reform voters will be very motivated. I think the SNP voters might be a mixed bag, but I think there's a good chance they might be more motivated than Labour voters. So I do think Reform's impact could be decisive in the end.
I think as well, Reform, I might be wrong to assume that Reform aren't taking any votes from the SNP, because there's people who just feel completely disconnected from, mainstream politics. But they're probably picking up, a bit more of the unionist vote than the kind of nationalist vote. And ultimately, I mean, I totally take what you're saying about the Tories here, but I think the Tories, similar to their other one by-election in 2023,
Yep.
2023, I should really know that, seeing as it was my local town. But I think quietly, they wouldn't be too bothered with a Labour victory. I think deep down the Tories would probably think that's not the worst thing in the world. They would never admit it, of course, and it still gives them time to recover for next year. So I do think Labour will suffer the most, but I do take Dan's point about the Tories as well.
So leaving aside the Hamilton by-election for now, I'm sure we'll be talking about that particular electoral race for many weeks to come between now and June. The other big political news, though, this week came today from the UK Supreme Court in London, where just hours before we recorded this episode, judges unanimously ruled that a woman is defined by biological sex under equalities law. Now, this marks the end of a long-running legal battle, about 3 years roughly, which could have major implications for how sex-based rights apply Scotland, England and Wales. Just to be brief on this, on the kind of background, the court sided with campaign group For Women Scotland. They brought a case against the Scottish Government, arguing that sex-based protections should only apply to people that are born female. Now, since that ruling, John Swinney said that his government, quote, accepts the ruling of the Supreme Court, and adding that, quote, protecting the rights of all will inform his government's response. Now, Dickie, coming to you first, because I know how closely the Express has followed this story. Was this ruling anything of a surprise to you?
No, I think a woman is a woman. It's a pretty simple statement to make. I'm very aware that we're kind of three guys sitting here discussing it, so you're maybe not best placed to be involved. But the vast majority of women that I've spoke to about this were very much siding with For Women Scotland. They feel, decades of advancement in women's rights was being, eroded, put under threat. These kind of single-sex spaces were under threat. And I think it's pretty basic. For me, it was pretty basic stuff. And what again, it kind of exposes is you've got to ask who's advising the Scottish Government? Because this isn't the first time they've went to the Supreme Court and been hammered. We were going through it before we came in here. We came up with 10 almost straight away, where they went to a really high court and being completely humiliated at taxpayers' expense. Now they'll say, they've got to defend their policies, but who's drafting these policies?
I should add that this was an appeal to the Supreme Court, because the Scottish Government did win a previous round of this particular legal battle in Scotland. It was in 2022 when Judge Lady Haldane said the definition of sex was, quote, not limited to biological or birth sex. So this was a step up from that ruling in 2022. But I do take your point, Dickie, that on the Supreme Court in particular, the Scottish Government has fought and lost a number of high-profile cases, not just on gender issues, but on things like the India F2, whether Holyrood had the right to call that, on the impact of the Brexit vote and all the rest of it. Just coming to you, Dan. Now, Amnesty International, I'm picking them as a representative of people of people who are disappointed by this ruling. They said they were disappointed with it, potentially considering the consequences for trans people, and just tying into that, I felt that this was a particularly So Judge Lord Hodge, who's one of the Supreme Court justices, in his ruling today, he said this should not be seen as a triumph of one side over the other, and stressed that the law still gives protection against discrimination to transgender people. Dan, I guess my question for you is, the Scottish Government has been very vocal on gender issues, particularly under Nicola Sturgeon. Now we have John Swinney in charge. Do you think that the current First Minister, will he be content to let this slide now? Do you feel that maybe this is something he can move on from?
I think the Supreme Court ruling, which I don't know to what extent it was a surprise in sort of the circles that are really following this story, but I've read that it went a lot further than was necessarily expected. But what it does provide is very, very obvious clarity on the issue of how these laws interrelate. And so that does, and we've already seen John Swinney say he accepts the findings. He would expect nothing less, but it does now give him political cover to unwind and untangle some of these really controversial policies. And obviously John Swinney was integral to Nicola Sturgeon's government. He was at the heart of sort of the advance of this agenda. And I think he will also want to reassure trans people, I'm sure, because a lot of trans people will be feeling vulnerable after this ruling. But I think also worth noting that the Supreme Court ruling doesn't actually infringe on trans people's rights in any way that I could see. That they're still protected under the Equality Act from discrimination and harassment. Obviously, not all activists are going to feel that way. But even the charity Scottish Trans was saying, there isn't a need to panic. This might feel like a backward step, but we still need to see what that means. But just to get back to your question, I think for John Swinney, he's clearly trying to present himself ahead of the election as a sort of safe pair of hands, interested in common sense issues and bread and butter issues, and whether or not he would have actually taken this route otherwise, certainly it gives him the political cover to sort of untangle this to some extent.
John Swinney will be delighted. He will be absolutely
privately,
delighted.
You think
privately, he will be delighted because this issue has ripped his party apart over the past 2 years, and this is a chance for him to put it to bed, where he's in much not strong ground is why so much public money has been spent, kind of defending this, and I think that's where he might face questions. But privately, I think it'll be popping the champagne corks.
I wanted to ask you, Dickie, as well, on the political fallout from this here in Scotland. This is a UK-wide ruling, we shouldn't forget, but Joanna Cherry, former SNP MP, has obviously been very, very vocal on this issue. She said today Nicola Sturgeon should apologise to Scottish women following the ruling. Is that going too far, do you think?
No, because I think not necessarily in terms of the policy and the law, but the way that people who raised really legitimate concerns about this were painted as bigots, right-wing extremists, and I think Nicola Sturgeon does owe some of those many of those campaigners an apology. She's not the only one who owes apologies. There was others. These were legitimate concerns about opening up. I know the case related to board membership in Scotland, but moving on, the wider debate, the gender recognition certificate, the simplifying of it, as a way of getting, you know, that you don't need to go through gender reassignment. Thing is, we've got to remember, you know, almost at the side of this is a relatively small group of people who've you know, really serious issues and obviously deserve support. But the whole thing, when you think back on it now, it just seems bonkers to me that all you need to do is effectively tick a box, say you've lived 3 months as a woman, and then all of a sudden you can legally be a woman. I understand that's not what this case was about, but the whole debate, it seems such a weird thing for Nicola Sturgeon to really, you know, pin her political future to.
I mean, I do feel that on the GRC debate, we've come a long way from 2022 when legislation was passed at Holyrood, when we should say with cross-party support, on making it easier to self-identify your gender. Between then and now, the political landscape does seem to have changed very quickly. We have obviously seen change in leadership across parties, and the Scottish Government's legislation being upended by Alistair Jack, the former Scottish Secretary. But the Scottish Government now under John Swinney has been clear that they're not bringing back that legislation anytime soon. But that's not to say that maybe after next year's election, depending on the result, that maybe it will rear its head again. I mean, what will be interesting is where this plays within the party manifestos. Now, obviously, it's not going to be anywhere near the Scottish Conservatives or Reform UK. We know what the Greens will say on the issue. But how the SNP, what if the SNP made this a manifesto commitment? I think that's an unanswered question, particularly, or you know, how strong a case they make for it in their manifesto remains to be seen. So while this is a line that's been drawn under part of the argument today, I mean, I think this is something that will run and run. But for now, I think we have run out of time. So I'll draw things to a conclusion for today and just say thanks to Dan, thanks to Dickie for joining me in the studio. And we will be back again, or certainly some of the guys will be back again with regular host Paul Hutchin next week. But as for me, I'll say goodbye for now and thanks for listening.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.